Miss Ursula Winwood, hatless but with a cotton sunshade swinging over her shoulder, and with a lean, shiny, mahogany-colored Sussex Spaniel trailing behind, walked in her calm, deliberate way down the long carriage drive of Drane's Court. She was stout and florid, and had no scruples as to the avowal of her age, which was 43. She had clear blue eyes, which looked steadily upon a complicated world of affairs, and a square, heavy chin, which showed her capacity for dealing with it. Miss Ursula Winwood knew herself to be a notable person, and the knowledge did not make her vain, or crotchety, or imperious. She took her notability for granted, as she took her mature good looks and her independent fortune. For some years she had kept house for her widowed brother, Colonel Winwood, conservative member for the division of the county in which they resided, and helped him efficiently in his political work. The little township of Morebury, half a mile from the great gates of Drane's Court, felt Miss Winwood's control in diverse ways. Another town, a little further off, with 5 or 6 millions of inhabitants, was also, through its newspapers, aware of Miss Winwood. Many leagues, societies, associations claimed her as president, vice president, or member of council. She had sat on royal commissions. Her name, under an appeal for charity, guaranteed the deserts of the beneficiary, which did not know about housing problems, factory acts, female prisons, hospitals, asylums for the blind, decayed gentlewomen, sweated trades, dogs' homes, and friendly societies could not be considered in the light of knowledge. She sat on platforms with royal princesses, archbishops welcomed her as a colleague, and cabinet ministers sought her counsel. For some distance from the porch of the red brick, creeper-covered Queen Anne housed the gravel drive between the lawns blazed in the afternoon sun. For this reason, the sunshade. But after a while came an avenue of beech and plane and oak, casting delectable shade on the drive and its double edging of grass, and the far-stretching riot of flowers beneath the trees, foxgloves and canterbury bells, and campanulas and delphiniums, all blues and purple and whites, with here and there the pink of dog roses and gorgeous yellow splashes of celandine. On entering this stately coolness, Miss Winwood closed her sunshade and looked at her watch. A solid timepiece harbored in her belt. A knitted brow betrayed mathematical calculation. It would take her 5 minutes to reach the lodge gate. The train bringing her venerable uncle, Archdeacon Winwood, for a week's visit would not arrive at the station for another 3 minutes, and the 2 fat horses would take 10 minutes to drag from the station the landau which she had sent to meet him. She had therefore 8 minutes to spare. A rustic bench invited repose. Graciously she accepted the invitation. Now, it must be observed that it was not Miss Winwood's habit to waste time. Her appointments were kept to the minute, and her appointment, self-made on this occasion, was the welcoming of her uncle, the Archdeacon, on the threshold of Drane's Court. But Miss Winwood was making holiday and allowed herself certain relaxations. Her brother's health having broken down, he had paired for the rest of the session and gone to Contractsville for a cure. She had therefore shut up her London house in Portland Place, Colonel Winwood's home while Parliament sat, and had come to her brother's house, Drane's Court, her home when her presence was not needed in London. She was tired. Drane's Court, where she had been born and had lived all her girlhood's life, was restful, and the seat on the shade of the great bench was cunningly curved. The shiny, mahogany-colored spaniel, prescient of siesta, leaped to her side and lay down with his chin on her lap and blinked his yellow eyes. She lay back on the seat, her hand on the dog's head, looking contentedly at the opposite wilderness of bloom and the glimpses, through the screen of trees and shrubs, of the sunlit stretches of park beyond. She loved Drane's Court. Save for the 3 years of her brother's short married life, it had been part of herself. A Winwood, a very younger son of the family being that of which the Earl of Harpenden is head, these things can only be written of in capital letters, had acquired wealth in the dark political days of Queen Anne, and had bought the land and built the house, and the property had never passed into alien hands. As for the name, he had used that of his wife, Viscountess Drane, in her own right, a notorious beauty of whom, so history recounts, he was senilely enamored, and on whose naughty account he was eventually run through the body by a young Mohawk of a paramour. They fought one spring dawn in the park. The traditional spot could be seen from where Ursula Winwood was sitting. Ursula and her brother were proud of the romantic episode, and would relate it to guests and point out the scene of the duel. Happy and illusory days of romance now dead and gone, it is not conceivable that generations hence the head of a family will exhibit with pride the stained newspaper cuttings containing the unsavory details of the divorce case, of his great-great-grandmother. This aspect of family history seldom presented itself to Ursula Winwood. It did not do this so mellow and contented afternoon. Starlings mindful of a second brood chattered in the old walnut trees far away on the lawn. Thrushes sang their deep-throated bugle calls. Finches twittered. A light breeze creeping up the avenue rustled the full foliage languorously. Ursula Winwood closed her eyes. A bumblebee droned between visits to foxglove bells nearby. She loved bumblebees. They reminded her of a summer long ago when she sat, not on this seat, as a matter of fact it was in the old walled garden a quarter of a mile away, with the gallant young fellow's arms about her and her head on his shoulder. A bumblebee had droned round her while they kissed. She could never hear a bumblebee without thinking of him, but the gallant young fellow had been killed in the Sudan in 1885, and Ursula Winwood's heart had been buried in his sandy grave. That was the beginning and end of her sentimental history. She had recovered from the pain of it all, and now she loved the bumblebee for invoking the exquisite memory. The lithe Sussex spaniel crept further on her lap, and her hand caressed his polished coat. Drowsiness disintegrated the exquisite memories. Miss Ursula Winwood fell asleep. The sudden plunging of strong young paws into her body in a series of sharp barks and growls awakened her with a start, and, for a second, still dazed by the drowsy invocation of the bumblebee, she saw approaching her the gallant fellow who had been pierced through the heart by a Sudanese spear in 1885. He was dark and handsome and, by a trick of coincidence, was dressed in loose knickerbocker suit, just as he was when he had walked up that very avenue to say his last goodbye. She remained for a moment tense, passively awaiting coordination of her faculties. Then, clear awake and sending scrubbing the dear ghosts of the past, she sat up and, catching the indignant spaniel by the collar, looked with a queer sudden interest at the newcomer. He was young, extraordinarily beautiful, but he staggered and reeled like a drunken man. The spaniel barked his respectable disapproval. In his long life of 18 months he had seen many people, postmen and butcher boys and casual diggers in kitchen gardens, whose apparent permit to exist in Drains Court had been an insoluble puzzle, but never had he been so outrageous a trespasser. With unparalleled moral courage he told him exactly what he thought of him, but the trespasser did not hear. He kept on advancing. Miss Winwood rose, disgusted, and drew herself up. The young man threw out his hands towards her, tripped over the 3-inch high border of grass, and fell in a sprawling heap at her feet. He lay very still. Ursula Winwood looked down upon him. The shiny brown spaniel took up a strategic position 3 yards away and growled, his chin between his paws. But the more Miss Winwood looked, and her blue eyes were trained to penetrate, the more was she convinced that both she and the dog were wrong in their diagnosis. The young man's face was deadly white, his cheeks gone. It was evident a grave manner. For a moment or so, she had a qualm of fear lest he might be dead. She bent down, took him in her capable grip, and composed his inert body decently, and placed the knapsack he was wearing beneath his head. The faintly beating heart proved him to be alive, but her touch on his brow discovered fever. Kneeling by his side, she wiped his lips with her handkerchief, and gave herself up to the fraction of a minute's contemplation of the most beautiful youth she had ever seen. So there he lay, a new Endymion, while the most modern of Dianas hung over him, stricken with great wonderment at his perfection. In this romantic attitude she was surprised, first by the coachman of the landau in Paris, he swung round the bend of the drive, and then by the archdeacon, who leaned over the door of the carriage. Miss Winwood sprang to her feet, the coachman pulled up, and the archdeacon alighted. "My dear Uncle Edward," she wrung his hand, "I'm so glad to see you. Do help me grapple with an extraordinary situation." The archdeacon smiled humorously. He was a spare man of 70, with thin, pointed, clean-shaven face and clear blue eyes like Mrs. Winwood's. "If there's a situation, my dear Ursula, which you can't grapple," said he, "it must indeed be extraordinary." She narrated what had occurred, and together they bent over the unconscious youth. "I would suggest," said she, "that we put him into the carriage, drive him up to the house, and send for Dr. Fuller." "I can only support your suggestion," said the archdeacon. So the coachman came down from his box and helped them to lift the young man into the landau, and his body swayed helplessly between Miss Winwood and the archdeacon, whose breeches and gaiters were smeared with dust from his heavy boots. A few moments afterwards he was carried into the library and laid upon a sofa, and Miss Winwood administered restoratives. The deep stupor seemed to pass, and he began to moan. Miss Winwood and the housekeeper stood side by side, the Archdeacon, his hands behind his back, paced the noiseless turkey carpet. "I hope," said he, "your doctor will not be long in coming." "It looks like a sunstroke," the housekeeper remarked as her mistress scrutinized the clinical thermometer. "It doesn't," said Miss Winwood bluntly. "In sunstroke, the face is either congested or clammy. I know that much. He has a temperature of 103. "Poor fellow," said the Archdeacon. "I wonder who he is," said Miss Winwood. "Perhaps this may tell us," said the Archdeacon. From the knapsack, carelessly handled by the servant who had brought it in, he escaped a book, and the servant had laid the book on the top of the knapsack. The Archdeacon took it up. "Sir Thomas Browne's Religio Medici and Urn Burial," on the flyleaf. "Paul Savelli, an undergraduate, I should say, on a walking tour." Miss Winwood took the book from his hands, a little cheap reprint. "I'm glad," she said. "Why, my dear Ursula?" "I'm very fond of Sir Thomas Browne myself," she replied. Presently the doctor came and made his examination. He shook a grave head. Pneumonia. And he got it bad. Perhaps a touch of the sun as well. The housekeeper smiled discreetly. "Looks half-starved, too. I'll send up the ambulance at once and get him to the cottage hospital." Miss Winwood, a practical woman, was aware that the doctor gave wise counsel, but she looked at Paul and hesitated. Paul's destiny, though none knew it, hung in the balance. "I disapprove altogether of the cottage hospital," she said. "Eh?" said the doctor. The Archdeacon raised his eyebrows. "My dear Ursula, I thought you had made the Morebury Cottage Hospital the model of its kind." "Its kind is not for people who carry about Sir Thomas Browne in their pocket," retorted the disingenuous lady. "If I turned him out of my house, doctor, and anything happened to him, I should have to reckon with his people. He stays here. You will kindly arrange for nurses. The red room. Wilkins. No, the green. The one with the small oak bed. You can't nurse people properly in 4 posters. It has a southeast aspect," she turned to the doctor, "and so gets the sun most of the day. That's quite right, isn't it?" "Ideal, but I warn you, Miss Winwood, you may be letting yourself in for a perfectly avoidable lot of trouble." "I like trouble," said Miss Winwood. "You're certainly looking for it," replied the doctor, glancing at Paul and stuffing his stethoscope into his pocket. "And in this case, I can promise you worry beyond dreams of anxiety." The word of Ursula Winwood was law for miles around. Dr. Fuller, rosy, fat, and 50, obeyed like everyone else. But during the process of lawmaking, he had often, before now, played the part of an urbane and gently satirical leader of the opposition. She flashed round on him with a foolish pain through her heart that caused her to catch her breath. "Is he as bad as that?" she asked quickly. "As bad as that," said the doctor with grave significance. "How he managed to get here is a mystery." Within a quarter of an hour, the unconscious Paul, clad in a suit of Colonel Winwood's silk pajamas, lay in a fragrant room, hung with green and furnished in old black oak. Never once in all his life had Paul Kegworthy lain in such a room, and for him a great house was in commotion. Messages went forth for nurses and medicines and the paraphernalia of a luxurious sick chamber, and the lady of the house being absurdly anxious for a great London specialist, whose fee in Dr. Fuller's quiet eyes would be amusingly fantastic. "It seems horrible to search the poor boy's pockets," said Miss Winwood, when, after these excursions and alarms, the Archdeacon and herself returned to the library. "But we must try to find out who he is and communicate with his people. Savelli. I have never heard of them. I wonder who they are." "There is an historical Italian family of that name," said the Archdeacon. "I was sure of it," said Miss Winwood. "Of what?" "That his people are, well, all right." "Why are you sure?" Ursula was very fond of her uncle. He represented to her the fine flower of the Church of England, a gentleman, a scholar, an ideal physical type of the Anglican dignitary, a man of unquestionable piety and Christian charity, a personage who would be recognized for what he was by Hottentots or Esquimaux or attendants of wagon-led trains or millionaires of the Middle West of America or Parisian Apaches. In him the branch of the family tree had burgeoned into the perfect cleric, yet sometimes the play of light beneath the surface of those blue eyes, so like her own, and the delicately intoned challenges of his courtly voice exasperated her beyond measure. "It's obvious to any idiot, my dear," she replied testily. "Just look at him. It speaks for itself." The Archdeacon put his thin hand on her plump shoulder and smiled. The old man had a very sunny smile. "I'm sorry to carry on a conversation so Socratically," said he, "but what is it? I've never seen anything so physically beautiful, save the statues in the Vatican, in all my life. If he's not an aristocrat to the fingertips, I'll give up all my work, turn Catholic, and go into a nunnery, which will distress you exceedingly." And then, she waved a plump hand, and then, as I've said before, he reads the Religio Medici. The commonplace, vulgar young man of today no more reads Sir Thomas Browne than he reads Tertullian or the Upanishads. He also reads, said the Archdeacon, stuffing his hand into Paul's knapsack, against whose canvas the stiff outline of a book revealed itself. He also reads, he held up a little fat duodecimo, the Chantions de Berenger. That proves it, cries Miss Winwood. Proves what? His blue eyes twinkled, having a sense of humor. She laughed and flung her great arm around his frail shoulders. It proves, my venerable and otherwise distinguished dear, that I am right and you are wrong. My good Ursula, said he, disengaging himself, I have not advanced one argument either in favor of, or in opposition to, one single proposition this whole afternoon. She shook her head at him, pityingly. The housekeeper entered carrying a double handful of odds and ends, which she laid on the library table. A watch and chain in cornelian heart, a cigarette case bearing the initials P.S., some keys, a very soiled handkerchief, a sovereign, a shilling, and a penny. Dr. Fuller had sent them down with his compliments. They were the entire contents of the young gentleman's pockets. Not a card, not a scrap of paper with a name and address on it, cried Miss Winwood. Not a scrap, miss. The doctor and I searched most thoroughly. Perhaps the knapsack will tell us more, said the Archdeacon. The knapsack, however, revealed nothing but a few toilet necessities, a hunk of stale bread, and a depressing morsel of cheese, and a pair of stockings and a shirt declared by the housekeeper to be wet through. As the Berenger, like the Sir Thomas Browne, was inscribed Paul Savelli, which corresponded with the initials on the cigarette case, they were fairly certain of the young man's name. But that was all they could discover regarding him. We'll have to wait until he can tell us for himself, said Miss Winwood later to the doctor. We'll have to wait a long time, said he.